This is Lucinda, and before we get going with our first episode of the year, I wanted to give you a heads up that Third Sector, the conference, is back again for 2025. First release tickets are now on sale for this 2-day event, which is happening in June. We'll be bringing together the leading voices in fundraising, finance, tech, and charity leadership. And if you book now, you could save £200 on the full price. I look forward to seeing you there.
Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. And as is now customary, we're starting the new year with two of the sector's leaders to ask what the next 12 months might have in store for the voluntary sector.
As most charities continue to face the perfect storm of higher costs and lower incomes, combined with increased demand for their services, we're going to ask how they can continue to fight the good fight and even find cause for optimism.
We're delighted to be joined by two guests for this discussion. First up is Polly Neate, Chief Executive of the housing and homelessness charity Shelter. Polly, your perspective on the coming year is going to be a bit different to most, as you have only a matter of weeks left until you bid farewell to Shelter after 7 years in post. Are you able to tell us what's coming next for you?
Well, short answer is not really, no. I've got quite a few irons in the fire, but I'm hoping they'll burn up by the time I leave. I'm going to definitely I'm doing an executive coaching qualification. What I kind of want to do is work with leadership teams with my strategy development experience and then that executive coaching expertise to kind of support organisations with their strategy and particularly strategy implementation and ownership, because that's the key probably. And in such a challenging year to come, not to be negative, I'm hoping there'll be quite a lot of need for that.
Also with us is Wanda Wyporska, Chief Executive of the refugee relief charity Safe Passage International. She's about to enter her second year in post and previously served as Chief Executive of the Black Equity Organisation and the Society of Genealogists. Hello, Wanda. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to structure this discussion around the various aspects of running a charity. And since you are both members of the Charity Reform Group, which seeks to amplify the voices of charities in the public debate, I think a good place to kick off this discussion is campaigning. Your respective charities focus on housing and immigration, two issues that are high up on the political agenda. But charitable cause areas across the board will, of course, be seeking to get their voices heard, not least as we're only 6 months into our new government. So, Polly, how can charities strengthen their voices to get heard by government louder?
I mean, there's a difference between, I guess, being heard by government and being heard in the public discourse. Both are very important and they influence each other. I guess in terms of being heard by government, though, what I would say is the government really need to make more space for civil society much earlier in their development of strategies, missions, and all the rest of it. I don't think there's any lack of readiness or willingness on the part of charities to engage, but I think the way government is operating is, we could get a charity to do this bit of policy work for us that we already want to do. And I guess what we need to see is a shift from that so that the strategy that policy fits into is developed with the voices of civil society really at the centre of that. And I don't think that is happening enough yet. So that's, in terms of government, that's really important. In terms of speaking out publicly, I think it is really important that charities have the courage of their convictions on this. You know, it's not a right to speak out. It's a duty to speak out because of the importance of the issues that charities are dealing with. If we don't speak out on housing, speak our truth to power, and it's great having Wanda here actually, because the relationship between housing and debates around race and immigration is a real problem area. And we at Shelter have taken a decision to speak out really clearly on that, because a lot of people make the link between immigration and housing in quite a racist way. And we've taken the decision to challenge that. Yes, of course, we get a lot of flack for it, but it's absolutely right in terms of our charitable purpose. And so I guess what I would say is charities do need to have the courage of their convictions, and boards need to back their CEOs and back their teams when it comes to speaking truth to power in that way.
And you've said publicly that you've led Shelter to become more activist in spirit since you joined the charity a few years ago.
Hopefully, yeah.
How can other charities follow suit in that? I mean, there's been criticism of the sector that it's self-censoring. Is that your sense as a whole? And if so, how can we overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to self-censor as a charity chief exec and as a charity. And it's almost easy to fall into it without realizing. But I think some of this is about what we react to. So it's really important, as well as having our own set piece reports and pieces of work that we PR in the media as charities, I feel it's really important that charity leaders are able to come in and comment on breaking news and things that happen, even if those things are controversial, if it's in line with, what the charity stands for. And I'd also like to see, and this is part of why we founded the Charity Reform Group, I would like to see charity leaders having a voice in wider debates as well. Well, Wanda is one of the very few who's actually been on Question Time, and all power to her. She was absolutely brilliant. So she can talk about this more than I can. But, a charity leader can answer on a range of topics and is perfectly well able to not say the wrong thing on the telly, just as much as somebody representing a large corporation, for example. So I also think, as well as speaking out about our own areas, we need to have the confidence that we have something to contribute to the national discourse more widely.
Yeah, so let's come to you, Wanda, on that question of campaigning. How can charities strengthen their voices to be heard more clearly in the public realm and also with the government?
Well, I think, Polly's absolutely right. There are so many different routes. And when we're thinking about government, one of the things I'd like charities to really think about is devolution and local government, because there is more and more devolution and there's more chance of getting change in a local area and activists in their local area knowing what's going on there and knowing what the issues are than there is at Westminster most of the time. So I would really urge charities to think about the local. The other thing I would say as well is that we have to, and the government as well, have to stop siloing all of the issues. As Polly said, immigration is relevant to housing, it's relevant to racism, and it's a real shame for me, having stepped into this sector almost a year ago, to recognise and realise that there are many refugee organisations that aren't talking about race, that aren't seeing racial discrimination and injustice as the heart of the systemic process, which is forcing black and brown children to die in the Channel because they haven't got a safe route, and then we're actually allowing, and rightly so, Ukrainians to come over in their time of need by plane. There is such a difference here. So we have to recognise that every charity is operating in an intersectional way. Having led the Black Equity Organisation, that's not just about Black people, that's about Black people who are queer, Black people who are children, Black people who are old, Black people who are female or male. We can't keep siloing these issues. And having also led the Equality Trust in my first CEO role, looking at economic inequality is absolutely essential, because that's what's underpinning most of the issues that charities are here to deal with. So I think, we have to take that big structural approach, and charities have to not be scared about thinking about the systems, about thinking about long-term change. One of the amazing things about working at Safe Passage International is that I actually get to see things happen in real time, and I get to see results. I get to see families reunite. Having worked on race and economic justice and recognise that I'm not going to see much change in my lifetime, but that we are holding the baton to pass on to the next generation, there's a huge change there. And I think also, when we're thinking about the public, we can't forget the fact that there are so many charities working on each issue. And we know why charities are in competition because of funds, whether it's from trusts and foundations or whether it's from the public. But I really do think that there's a strong reason for charities to come together and for charities to work together much more successfully, not just in their own sectors, but actually across sectors. So doing a piece of work at the moment about bringing the racial justice sector together with the refugee and migration sector. I mean, it's a no-brainer, but the fact that nobody's really done that before speaks volumes about how divided and how siloed our sector really is.
And what sort of things can be done practically to encourage that collaboration and work together that you've just described?
Well, I mean, I have to declare an interest here. I'm a trustee at Esme Fairbairn Foundation as well. And I think one of the powers that we recognise in the funding sector is that we have the power to convene. And so I think trusts and foundations are thinking about that more and more now. But it takes a lack of ego, if I'm really honest. It takes a lack of really strong ego in terms of CEOs to actually work together, because we are more or less in competition. And so I think breaking down those barriers and saying, actually, we're going to achieve far much if we work together, not just as individual sectors, but across civil society. And that will be so much more powerful. I mean, just imagine it.
Polly, I wonder if you have anything to add to that, thinking specifically as well about the next year, if there's anything tangible that civil society and charity leaders can be doing to better promote and foster collaboration between other organisations.
So I agree with Wanda's point about funders, and I think it's not only charitable funders. In fact, it's not primarily charitable funders that feed competition. A lot of that happens at the commissioning level locally, and it's really important that commissioners start to learn some of the lessons that the charitable funders are starting to learn, and I would really like to see that in the next year. I also think it needs a mature conversation, right? So Wanda said this as well. I think we're going to be agreeing a lot today. But Wanda said this: we are in competition. That's a reality. So let's be mature about that and understand where we're in competition and where we need to collaborate, rather than, I think there's a kind of fear of competition that almost makes people not want to recognize it. And unless we recognize it in a mature way, we won't come together. If you look at businesses, competition in the business world is much more cutthroat than it is in the charity world. A lot of people say, oh, charities are getting more like businesses. I mean, I've still spent as much time in the private sector as I have in the charitable sector, and I can tell you there's a huge difference. Charities are not businesses, and they're not even like them in most cases. But there is competition. And if you look at the business world, that competition is recognised. It's an absolutely natural part of life. But also, where there's common cause, a lot of the time, those businesses, don't you worry, if they need to work together to get what they need from government, they will do that. And so I think we need to see that realistic conversation about acknowledging the reality of competition and moving beyond that in a kind of mature way. So for me, I think in the next year, we could see commissioners doing more to try not to foster competition. The only other thing I would say is I'm not a fan of funders insisting on collaboration before you can even bid for funding. And I've seen collaborations come together because of that don't work, and that actually it might have been better for both of those organisations to come up with the best possible proposal they could, and one of them get the funding. So I think forcing collaboration is a bad idea, and then all the more onus needs to be on charities themselves to be proactive in developing collaboration where it's most relevant and important.
This time last year, Sue Tibbles from the Sheila McKechnie Foundation spoke of a moment of reset and renewal for the voluntary sector as we awaited a general election. 6 months into the Labour government, Wanda, what's your assessment of the reality for the sector in terms of that relationship between the government and the voluntary sector?
Well, I mean, I think we'd all been preparing for a potential change of government, and we always were using the word potential to cover ourselves there. And I think there was a lot of activity. I mean, certainly I met more friends than ever at Labour conference this year than I think I have in many, many years. And there was a buzz about that. And there was expectation. And I think, one of the key things for the charity sector, and I've heard this so many times in the last couple of months, has been we need to give them time. Now, everybody's got different views about that. I would say personally, As a charity, we don't give anybody time because we're looking at the policies. And if we're critical of the policies, we're critical of the policies. And it doesn't matter if a government's been in post for 3 days or 10 years. So I think this is causing a little bit of tension in the sector. And I think there is also tension because there were huge expectations of a change of government, as there always is. And I think that certainly if we look at immigration and the way in which the current government is talking about immigration and saying that there won't be any safe routes, I mean, obviously we hope that that opinion will change, and we're here to persuade them that it needs to change. But I think charities have to sort of come out of that complacency a little bit and recognize that, the fight is still there. We still need to, it's not Christmas and we're not getting everything on our wish list by any stretch of the imagination. So it's taking a time of adjustment, I think.
And Polly, the same question to you. What's your assessment?
I was worried before the general election that if we saw a Labour government, that the sector would be inclined to let them off the hook a bit and not hold them to account as vigorously as we did the Conservative government. Although, again, I mean, I think there's always a danger with governments of any colour of the sector thinking that that inside track of influence has to stop you from being vocal outside. And I really don't agree with that. I do think there's a bit of a tendency happening to let the government off the hook and not speak out where we really disagree with policies or think they need to be improved. I also think it would help if the government was able to manage that relationship in a mature way where the sector is brought in, as I said earlier, at the earliest stage to set strategy so that the civil society has a voice in that and isn't suddenly seeing things happening and thinking, oh my God, we don't like this. So there's that bringing in, but then the government also needs to be realistic about the fact that it is our role to be critical of policies if we don't agree. And it's not only that the charity sector has some expectations that the government is going to be its friend. The government, in many cases, including ministers, have some expectations that we somehow have an obligation to be their friend or not to criticise them. And they need to have that mature sense of what a relationship between the sector and the government needs to look like. So to me, there are some teething problems on both sides, but actually I am optimistic overall. I think there are huge opportunities if the relationship matures and settles down a bit on both sides. As I say, I think there are huge opportunities to make a real difference.
We watch this space. I'd like to move on to more of an internal look at charities and how they are run, and thinking specifically about staffing and the chief executive churn. That's something that we've been seeing for a few years now. Wanda, what's your perspective on that?
Well, I'm really pleased actually you mentioned the issue of chief executive churn, because I think in the last year, probably 4 or 5 fellow chief executives I've worked with or know have said, actually, I've had enough of this. I think there are many different factors. I think there are increased and different expectations from staff. There's hybrid working, which makes relationships different. It's positive for some people, obviously, with caring duties and other things. It's a little bit difficult to have that great sort of brainstorming campaigns meeting on Zoom rather than in a room all together. I think some people are missing out on learning opportunities as well from not being around other people, particularly staff who are in their first or second role. So I think there's a number of challenges there. But I think also, and this is something that I've written about quite often, is the fact that the system of having a board responsible for a charity that, in the worst case scenario, meets for a couple of hours 4 times a year. Now, that's the worst case scenario. We have boards that are much better than that. We have supportive trustees and we have supportive chairs, of course. But I do think that it's not the right structure when charities and the CEOs and the staff are really going through a much tougher time, I think, now than ever. There are so many demands from the public, from politicians as well, because they will do that thing of dropping you a line last thing because they urgently need a bit of advice or a bit of or some factual information. And I just don't really think that the structure we've got at the moment is the best way of supporting chief executives and staff and charities.
What can be done to improve it?
Well, I mean, that is a whole sort of research project, isn't it? I mean, I think, we, even in the private sector, as Polly said, we have boards, we have non-executive directors. Obviously, it works in a slightly different way. But this is a very Victorian model. And, we are probably 150 years away from that now. So I think looking at refreshing how charities are run in terms of governance and a board would be a great step. Now, I'm not bashing all boards, obviously. I've worked with some really great boards and really great trustees and chairs, but I think it makes the relationship for the CEO and the board and the CEO and the staff quite precarious in a sense. And I think we'd all say that when it runs well, it's fantastic. It's an absolute dream. And I've had the privilege of being in that situation. But when it doesn't, you're trying to manage so many different moving parts. And I think because none of us, well, at least nobody that I know as a chief executive, goes into this for the glory or the money. You go into it and you work in an organization that you care absolutely passionately about the cause. And so it takes more than 100% of you. You don't switch off. It's very difficult to switch off entirely. And that's, partly why we do it, because we're passionate about it. But there is a huge toll that it takes. And I think people are just becoming more aware now and thinking, actually, I don't want to be in this situation. And going freelance, offering their support, offering their expertise, which I think is great because, as Polly said at the start, going into 2025, we all need to refresh our strategies and think about what we're going to do. So I'm sure Polly's going to have tons of work.
I mean, we'd love to hear your point of view on this as well, Polly. Obviously, we've already discussed that you're stepping down at the end of March as Chief Executive of Shelter. What's your take on this?
So Vanda's raised some quite complex points there. On the issue of boards, I've been incredibly fortunate with some of the boards that I've worked with, and actually in particular at Shelter. Having said that, I do actually think that the fact that you can't pay charity trustees in particular does create issues about diversity and about the kinds of people that have the time and the resources to serve on charity boards. I think there needs to be more training for boards, and that needs to be supported in some way, because it's quite difficult for charities to afford to develop a diverse group of trustees to have the expertise to do that, the role of a charity board. So I think that is an issue. In terms of the role, the chief exec role, well, look, for me, I'm stepping down because I really believe that Shelter needs somebody new for the next phase of its life. There are reasons why charity chairs in general only serve, certainly at Shelter, our chair can only serve 2 terms of 3 years. I've been at Shelter for 7 years, and I think the job does require a huge amount of fresh thinking, fresh ideas, and not to get too attached to the ways of doing things that you yourself as the chief exec have introduced and are super proud of. And I think for Shelter now, particularly at the moment, which is a moment of great opportunity, I believe, not without its challenges, of course, I think it's the right time for Shelter to have somebody new. It is also the case for me. I've had several major surgeries to recover from. I've had a life-changing accident to recover from during my time as chief exec of Shelter. And those things, I guess, have combined with the stresses of the job, that it's a lot. So if I didn't think it was the right time for Shelter for me to step away and for someone new to come in, I wouldn't be doing it. But of course, there are personal reasons as well. And the job has definitely changed. So I think when we're thinking about charity chief executives, we are thinking about somebody who has to be willing and able to lead in a total goldfish bowl, willing to deal with criticism from everywhere, from all sides, and who is able to make some very difficult decisions in that highly, highly visible environment. And that is definitely, over the time that I've worked in the sector, that that position has definitely shifted for sure, and there have been a lot of cultural trends in relation to workplaces that actually in the main, as I hope people at Shelter will know, I'm a huge fan of. I believe in internal activism. I believe in our people having much higher expectations of their employers. Passionately believe in that, actually. But what it does do is change the job. It changes the leadership role. And I think the sector needs to acknowledge that and support its chief executives accordingly. I actually have been supported in that, but I do know that that isn't universally the case.
Well, you've spoken very candidly about your own personal reasons for moving on, and thank you for that. But it's very interesting what you say about this change, which presumably is being felt more widely in terms of the pressures on chief executives.
Definitely.
And the level of scrutiny that they have. So, again, thinking about the year ahead, if there was one thing that needed to be changed to better support chief executives, to perhaps reverse the change that you've seen in recent years, to perhaps slow this churn that we're seeing increasingly, what would it be?
So for me, I wouldn't reverse most of the cultural changes that we've seen necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily want to go back to the much more top-down world of leadership. That's the first thing. I don't want to go back in time in that way. I don't agree with that. But I suppose in order to halt the churn of chief execs, I think we need boards and chairs that really understand the role and are trained and developed to understand it, and who also understand the perspective of the beneficiaries of the charity. So we need that to come together. You know, the priority of a charity is its beneficiaries, and they need to be front and centre at the governance level. But we also need a sophisticated understanding on the part of boards of what the leadership role in a charity now is. And as I say, genuinely, I'm not talking about Shelter here, but I am talking about the sector more widely. I think it's that combination of beneficiaries front and centre. We're here for our beneficiaries. We're not here for our staff, including the CEO, right? That's who we're here for. But we also really need that understanding of the role.
Yes, and that placing the beneficiary, the service user at the forefront really feeds into what you were saying, Wanda, earlier about the importance of lived experience and commitment to racial justice more broadly than the voluntary sector. But thinking about charities more specifically and how they run, how do you think, Wanda, that in the coming year they can place a greater emphasis on the importance of lived experience and encourage that?
I think there's a really good balance to be had between learned and lived experience. And I think it also comes back to the points we were making about government. And one of the points I've made consistently over the years is that if you don't have the right people with the right information making the decisions and making policy, then you're going to make bad policy. And I think we've all seen that. So making sure that the people making policy aren't just, as David Cameron said, the very clever people in the civil service, but making sure that government is listening to charities at the start, but also people with lived experience. I think we've got a real job on our hands to move beyond the sort of tokenistic, oh, here, we've got a policy, would you like to have a look at it? And then we tick the box that we've included people with lived experience. I think we have to be embedding people. And I said when I took this role that if there was someone with a refugee background, I would step down because it's not my position to take up that place. And that when I step down from this role, I want to hand the organisation over to somebody who has a refugee background. I think there has to be a real embedding from the start. And also we have to think about the issues and the equity behind actually hiring people with lived experience, not just I've been a press officer, I've done that case study thing, and you prepare someone for an interview and they talk about their experience. We all did that back in the day, and some organizations are still doing that. But what we really want to see is people in a decision making position, so that our SLT or our heads of campaigns or our heads of finance are people with lived experience, not just a sort of we're going to come to you a couple of times a year because, we feel we need to tick that box. And that takes real effort. It takes resource. It takes an attitude that says we may take someone who's got less experience, but we are going to support them to get to the place they need to be. And I think that's quite a problem for most charities, either because they're small and they don't have the resource, or if they're, we are always running to stand still, aren't we? So it's very difficult to actually say, we're going to make this work. But I think charities have to be braver, because what you gain from that is just absolutely incredible. And you can't really, as a charity, be doing your job properly if you're not really embedding that lived experience, especially in my sector.
We've talked about so many different areas here, and you've given us some fascinating insights of what you think the year ahead is going to hold. It would be really great if we could finish on some reasons to be cheerful in 2025. Wanda, what things can you pull out of the hat for us?
Well, for me, there are a couple of things. I think, as Polly said, this is a new government. They have started with a covenant. They have recognised that civil society exists and said they want to work with us. So that is very positive. And we all have many, many ideas for policies to save them the time of having to think them up themselves. So we're always going to be delighted to be discussing that. I do think also that the challenge that we are facing as a society, because of the political stirrings and I won't say emergence, because it's always been there, of the far right and far right activism, not just in the UK, but across the world, I think is going to be a real rallying point. And I'm hoping that this will bring organisations together to stand against those racist and prejudiced attitudes. So out of something bad, particularly, something can come something good, because we can't ignore this. And this, I think, is going to be one of the biggest issues for the charity sector, because we're not just looking at organisations such as Safe Passage International that work with refugees. We're not just looking at anti-racist organisations. We are looking at, as Polly has demonstrated, organisations that work in housing, organisations that work in education. A whole range of society are affected by those views.
Thanks, Wanda. And Polly, what are your reasons to be cheerful for 2025?
So I agree. I think the sector must and will find a rallying point around the potential destruction that's being wreaked on our democracy and on the values that I think as a sector we stand for, that has a real danger of creeping into the mainstream discourse. And I think we've seen that specifically over the last few days, that, a really racist narrative has taken hold, and where that then does influence the way all the mainstream media talk about a particular issue. I don't want to give it more airtime, but I think we have seen that. And I think there's an opportunity for the sector to have a voice in countering that, and we really need to take that opportunity and work together in order to make that happen. And I think there's a role actually for maybe people who are no longer in chief exec roles, and I'm hoping this as well, to be able to have a voice, because it's much easier to speak out when you're not in that situation. But I think it's incredibly important for the sector to come together, but I think it will. I have real hope that the sector will do that. And I think, let's be fair to the new government as well. They have brought the sector in. They have made an effort. There have been a lot of conversations, and there is an opportunity just in terms of basic, maybe siloed policies, but certainly in the area I work in of housing and homelessness, there are some real opportunities to make a very big difference by working with the new government. And I believe those opportunities will be taken by the sector, not only in housing, but in lots of other areas as well.
Polly, Wanda, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
No problem.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Polly and Wanda, and that's it for this week. We'll be back next time to speak to Kate Lee, the Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Society. Until then, all of us at Third Sector wish you a healthy and happy year ahead. Our producer is Nav Pal.